Well, first, apologies for being a few minutes late. One of the things that we're seeking to do, and I'm grateful for having the opportunity to be here in Herkimer County, is we're going to do a town hall in all 15 counties that make up New York 21. After redistricting, it is significantly expanded. We went from 12 to 15. We're going to do at least one before Election Day in every single county. Yesterday we were up in Franklin County. We've got a lot of terrain to cover, but we're putting a good number of miles on that truck. What I'd like to probably start off by doing is a little bit of introduction for those of you who don't know me, who I am, a little bit of my background, why I'm running, and then we can get into just sort of an open forum. I believe it's very important to show up in the community and talk with voters of all political stripes, not just our ardent supporters, not from one party or the other. And I hear from folks, don't really have that right now in our current incumbent representative. She doesn't make herself available to constituents. So one of the things we're doing is not just showing up, we're recording this. And we're going to put it on YouTube later so that others who maybe didn't have the opportunity to be here tonight will have access to some of the questions that you outlined for us to respond to. One thing to keep in mind is that I'm not a sitting member of Congress. So as we discuss things tonight, I won't have legislation to point to that I'm working on. But let's talk about the issues. Let's have an open forum. I'll address those questions that you may have. We would love to just hear some of your perspectives. Don't be shy about that. And there may be some things that I don't have an answer to, and I'll acknowledge that. But then I'll go work to try to get an answer to that question. At the very end, we'll probably preserve about 10 minutes or so, in which we'll sort of break things down. And if you don't feel comfortable asking a question in front of everybody or raising an issue with me, we'll have some private time where you could ask me one-on-one, if that's okay. So first things first, probably the most important thing that I can say is I'm Matt Castelli and I'm running for Congress. If you can't retain anything else here today, that's probably the most important two pieces of information that I can convey and that you can retain. So I was born and raised in the Hudson Valley area, not too far from the southern portion of the district. And I grew up in a bipartisan household. Mom's the Republican, Dad's the Democrat. And growing up, listen, politics and partisanship didn't matter. Our shared values mattered. And so I went to Siena College, not too far away from the southern portion of the district. And when I was there, 21 years ago, 9/11 happened. And that became a driving force for my career. I went and joined the CIA after that, served there for about 15 years doing counterterrorism work. Led teams hunting down some of the world's most dangerous terrorists. I worked in the same department that found Osama bin Laden, the most recent strike that was taken against the Al-Qaeda leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Those were all my friends. That's the work that we did. I led efforts against comparable bad guys, served in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and had enough success doing all of that that I was tapped by the Obama White House to come down and serve as the Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council, a role I was asked by the Trump administration to stay on, and I did for the first year of the Trump White House. Because if I learned anything throughout my career of public service, it's this. When it comes to protecting this country, our communities, my family, yours, it requires us to put country before party. My belief in that has never wavered. That's certainly something we're carrying forward in this campaign. Now, I went back to CIA, did some work with cutting edge tech startups, got a business degree out at Northwestern, and then COVID hit. Now, where I'm from in the Hudson Valley, it's not too far away from West Point. My grandfather was an Army doctor at West Point. When he got out of the Army, remains a physician, and he raised a family of nurses. With the exception of my mother, she served in a different way. She was a teacher. But my grandpa instilled within our family this sense of duty, a duty to care. So when COVID hit in 2020, we got to a point pretty quickly in the pandemic where we were having a 9/11 every single day in this country in terms of deaths. It was the most compelling challenge of our time. So I left government and I joined a healthcare organization here in New York, started by veterans, to better coordinate care for veterans, rural communities, by connecting health and social care together. An investment and a focus on our human and social service providers in the community, because that's where health and well-being happens. I was building out coordinated care networks throughout the Northeast for about a year and a half or so, loved what I was doing, really transformational work. And then January 6th happened. You might imagine, former counterterrorism guy, spent a career trying to prevent things like that from happening in foreign capitals. To see it happen in our own did not sit well with me. But what really didn't sit well with me was the response we saw from certain politicians, like our incumbent Congresswoman Stefanik. How she turned her back, in my view, on our democracy that day and subsequently. She certainly, I think, violated her oath to the Constitution, same oath that I took when I joined the CIA many years ago. And so it was not long after that that we decided to launch this campaign to challenge her. Because in that regard, and I think that that's a preeminent example, I believe she sold out our country. She sold out our national security in order to advance her own career, her own self-interest. But we all know that that's a pattern of behavior on her part. Certainly that day and on that issue, but she's done it time and time again. As I drive throughout the 15 counties that make up New York 21, I hear from folks who feel they don't have a representative who shows up and is voting for their interests in Washington. They think that she's voting for her interests and to advance her career. She sold out our veterans, she sold out our seniors, she certainly sold out women. And so in this campaign, it's really about rejecting someone who is solely focused on advancing her own self-interest and restoring a sense of true public service, about having a representative that works for us, who's investing in our future, not their future. And so that's what we're looking to do here in this campaign. We've been putting about 45,000 miles, I think, or so on the truck, meeting with folks at meet and greets, town halls like this. And that's my commitment, not just in this campaign, but in going forward, because I seek to be a representative for everyone. I'm applying for a job to be a representative for everyone. And one of the things, as Arlene was mentioning, is it's not just running as a Democrat. I'm running as the moderate party candidate. And I think that that's very important, because my orientation here is such that I think part of the problem with what we see in politics right now is that the loudest voices in the room are the ones on the extremes. Both sides, I think, are to blame for this. Certainly, some are getting a little more violent than others, but the loudest voices are on the extremes, and the vast majority of us who find ourselves in the middle, maybe we're center right, maybe we're center left, but we're in this large sort of majority of the middle, we don't have a voice anymore, and our issues aren't being addressed. And so in this campaign, we are running as the moderate party candidate to restore a voice for what I believe is the great moderate majority. And that's, I think, not just a solution for our community, I think it's a solution for much of, certainly Washington, but America, is to come back to the middle where we can work together and actually start solving some of the problems that affect all of us. So I'm going to pause there, and we're going to open it up. And I'd invite you to raise your hand, ask a question, raise an issue, and we can have a discussion.
Matt, I'm part of Individual Mohawk Valley, and we love canvassing and going door to door and telling people why we want to vote for you. I love your palm card. Where do I get a good van list to go campaigning? I know there are people here who want to go out with me and canvass, so let us know how we can do that.
Absolutely. So we can chat with Hannah afterwards, but the most direct place to do it, if you haven't already signed up to volunteer for our campaign, you can go to our website, castelliforcongress.com. There's a volunteer tab. You can fill out a form, enter in there, indicate what kinds of activities you want to be a part of in this campaign. Could be going door-to-door canvassing, could be doing phone banking. That's an important thing as well. But another place to reach out is field@castelliforcongress.com. That's a good email address for our field team, and then we can get you working, because it is an important thing that we will be working hard at, is the field game.
You also need more signs.
We've got them on order. I'm happy to see so many here, but there should be more being replenished. We're going to be getting them out to folks.
Matt, my name is Laura.
Hi, Laura.
When you are elected to Congress in November.
I like the use of the term when.
What are the first issues you want to try to tackle?
Yeah. I think the most compelling issue right now, and it's one that you have my sort of pledge and commitment on, is this threat, particularly to women's reproductive rights. And I think it's incumbent upon a new class of legislators coming in to make sure we codify that into law at the federal level. Because this erosion of an individual liberty that has occurred in the aftermath of that Supreme Court decision is one of the most egregious erosions of individual liberty in our nation's history. And in order to protect those millions of American women who are right now under threat, Congress needs to take action. And so that would be the first thing that I would step up to do because of the urgency of the matter.
With regard to health care, what do you think Elise Stefanik failed to do, and how will you correct it?
Yeah. So the question here is, what do we think Congresswoman Stefanik has failed to do regarding health care, and how do we correct it? Well, I think the biggest thing is to make investments in healthcare in our community. As I drive throughout the 15 counties that make up New York 21, many of those areas are rural. And the challenges we have in many of our rural communities are access to care. It's not necessarily a question about how do we pay for it, it's how do we find it? How do we make it available to folks? And it's not just a question, too, of the traditional healthcare, it's around mental health resources. It's around substance abuse resources. It's around things like housing and food pantries that really expand the definition of care. Elder care. We have a generation of folks who are now referred to as the sandwich generation because they're dealing with aging parents and they're dealing with challenges with childcare. And on that front, that definition of care on both of those fronts needs to be addressed. In my view, those are the kinds of resources and investments that need to be made available in our communities in order for our communities to thrive. Because when we face the challenges, I was just in, as I mentioned, Franklin County yesterday. We were talking about one of the healthcare facilities, Alice Hyde, which is managed by a Vermont-based health system. But the services are being cut dramatically. We don't have a maternity ward there anymore. And I was speaking with a pregnant woman a couple of months back. She's got to drive a couple of hours in order to get care for her forthcoming child. So it's a challenge. And the only way to address that challenge is making sure we're making those investments. Now, some of those challenges are tied to workforce shortages, whether it's nurses or doctors. How do we make sure that folks are coming to our community? But it's also the physical infrastructure. Where are we going to have a rethinking of how do we provide access to care within our communities? So that would be the top area. And she's had 8 years to address this, and all we've seen in that 8 years of her being in Congress is a reduction in services, a reduction of access. She hasn't made the kinds of investments that we need to champion those coming back here to the North Country, coming back to the Mohawk Valley region.
Hi, I'm Mary Ellen. I would love to hear your strategy your campaign strategy for engaging younger people.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that the only way to combat some of these representative flights to mind is to really turn out the youth vote. And
Yeah.
it's wonderful to see so many people here today, but you've got to engage
Yeah.
the youngsters.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what we define as young these days. Some people say that I'm young, and my knees don't feel that way. But you're exactly right, because it's actually a growing demographic of voters, and we've seen that. I think it's 18 to late 20s or so is one of the largest growing voting blocks. And what's very interesting about this voting block is that they're less likely to be identified with one party or the other, because they feel that the party system, these two parties in particular, at least the leadership now representing Washington, has been failing them. We're looking for results. We're not looking for decades to address issues. We want to see results in the 2-year time frame that we're electing certainly members of Congress. And so I think part of our outreach is around, we have a fellowship program where we've been bringing on board college fellows who've been involved in our campaign and reaching out to folks. There are many colleges and universities throughout the district that we're directly engaging with. And then I think it's really around the orientation of the message, is to say that I'm not really coming forward as the Democratic solution, the Democratic Party solution, or the Republican Party solution. It's identifying the critical issue that matters most. Now, I will say, we talked a little bit about this already. The issue of choice is one that's galvanizing a lot of young people as well. And it is unfortunate that it took a tragic scenario to see so many young people galvanized in support of participating in the political process, but they understand that in order to fight back against that extremism, we have to do so at the ballot box going forward. And we'll continue to champion that as an issue. We'll continue to reach out to those groups that are already organizing on their own, and maybe not a part of a traditional party establishment or part of a traditional sort of election establishment. We're going to get them involved in this race as well.
Well, it seems like a lot of the young people these days are more open to things, and they're into climate change, and more open about same-sex marriages and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's galvanizing too.
Yeah. Listen, we've got a lot of challenges as a nation and as a world. We want, our expectation, I think should be shared, is to have serious people interested in offering serious solutions to those challenges. One of the frustrations that I've had is that I don't think we got a lot of serious people in Washington actually interested in addressing the challenges in front of us. It's turned into the entertainment value. It's almost like professional wrestling, one side versus the other. And it's incumbent upon us as voters to be evaluating our elected representatives based upon the results they're producing for us on these compelling challenges. Not how good a Democrat they are or how good a Republican they are at fighting with the other side. That leaves us all worse. And so long as we're fighting with one another, we're never going to be in a position to fight for one another. And that's an orientation that I bring to this campaign. And future legislator as well, is to fight back against that and actually start focusing on those serious challenges that we have. I just want to be mindful of and afford other people the opportunity to come back.
I'll just
Yeah.
put out there, I'm now Herkimer County Majority Leader, thank you for taking the time, I'm Herkimer County, HR 1808, yes or no?
Which one was that?
HR, so,
Oh, the most recent one? So I probably would have voted against it, and here's why. Now, I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. The question is around HR 1808, which was a recent bill that was passed in the House about an assault weapons ban. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, carried firearms to include legitimate automatic weapons in the line of duty. Right now, what we have to recognize is that there is a moment of urgency to address rising gun violence in our communities, in our schools. Gun violence is now the #1 cause of death of our children. We have to do something about it. Now, my belief is that in order to do it, we have to do it through a coalition of law-abiding gun owners, those of us who support the Second Amendment, and folks who want to keep our kids and communities safe, to keep firearms, any firearm, out of the hands of someone that's going to do themselves or others harm. That is where we right now, I think, have a coalition that's focused. The challenge with some legislation, to include that one in particular, is sometimes phrases like assault weapons or style start to mean different things to different people, and the law-abiding gun owners and Second Amendment supporters start to break apart from the coalition that we need. And so my concern around those kinds of things is that it doesn't address the need and the urgency of the moment that we have right now, and that it becomes a wedge issue, and that's problematic.
How would you address that?
How would we address it?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think we need to focus necessarily on style of weapons. I think we talk about any gun being kept out of the hands of somebody that's going to do themselves or others harm. I don't think, because on one side of the extreme here, we've got Congresswoman Stefanik, who's married to a member of the gun lobby, who is seeing fit to make sure that every single cop killer, kid killer, domestic abuser, terrorist has unfettered access to firearms. There's no solution that she's put forward to try to limit access to weaponry to those individuals who might do harm to ourselves, to our kids, to our cops. So the work to be done is around universal background checks, or some of the red flag solutions out there that create tripwires within our community to identify those individuals who might pose a harm to themselves or to others, and to empower our law enforcement, to empower our communities to be in such a position to prevent them from having access to firearms. And so there's work that can and should be done in that regard, and I think it comes from having that coalition together to actually address the issue at hand.
So, I consider myself a moderate Democrat, and, I was troubled when I heard the slogan "Become Police."
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how you might bring people back to
Yeah.
a more, moderate approach toward that thinking.
Sure.
And make that message more clear to people
Yeah.
that want to target us with that.
Right. So the question, for those who couldn't hear it, is around a response from a moderate Democrat to those who might espouse or promote the concept of defunding our law enforcement, defunding the police. By way of background, I grew up around cop families. All of my friends growing up, ever since I was 4 years old, their dads were all cops. So I grew up in their families. They provided a sense of what it means to protect and serve that I think had an actual influence in my upbringing as well as my career choices. I also worked with law enforcement throughout the entirety of my career at the federal level, some of which, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq on the front lines. You're never going to hear me utter those words ever, except but to condemn them. And I will condemn those members of the far left who might promote some concept of defunding the police. Not only is it stupid, I think it's dangerous, and it leaves our communities less safe. And so we need to, I think, be in a position to call out the dangerous rhetoric, dangerous policies, because it does not serve us well. And we need to make sure that our law enforcement at the local level and at the federal level have our support and our resources to do the job we've asked them to do. They're public servants. They are serving our community, they're serving our country at the local, the state, and the federal level. And so we need to provide the kind of funding and support for our law enforcement to keep our communities and our families safe, as well as to keep our democracy safe, to prevent our capital from being overrun from violent insurrectionists. And so we need to make sure that it cuts both ways too. because there's hypocrisy from those others, like Elise Stefanik, who might say they back the blue, but there are exceptions to that for her. She doesn't support the law enforcement officers, the 5 that lost their lives in the aftermath of January 6th. She doesn't support the over 140 that suffered serious injuries on January 6th. It was her lies that led to that attack. She's right now attacking and putting a target on the backs of federal law enforcement who are trying to uphold the rule of law and making sure that they're protecting our national security surrounding these classified documents down in Florida. And so we have to call it out on both sides when there are these exceptions that are being made to that rule. But we should always advocate for making sure that our law enforcement at the local, state, and federal level have the resources and trust to do the job that we've asked them to do to protect and serve us.
My name is Brad Schumacher. I'm also a veteran.
Thank you for your service.
There's a lot of issues with veterans, as far as homeless veterans,
Yeah.
veterans health care. It has improved some, but it needs to, a long ways to go, you know what I'm saying? I also work in healthcare, I'm a military nurse as well, so I know how healthcare works. It needs a lot of more improvement, it needs more funding
Yeah.
to improve the system itself. Do you have any agenda, yes, if you're, when you're elected
Yeah.
to Congress, what the issues you're going to address?
Yeah.
Reference?
Right. So the question here is around veterans benefits, healthcare in particular, and what we would promote and push forward here. A little bit of orientation, and I think that this is also helpful to understand from our current incumbent Congresswoman, Elise Stefanik. While she talks a good game about support for veterans, down in Washington she's voted against their interests time and time again. Even just in recent months, there was one bill that would help provide for automatic healthcare enrollment for folks who are transitioning out of the military to automatically be enrolled in VA healthcare. Another instance was around education benefits for our Guard and reservists to have access to the GI Bill for their time. And then the most important, and I think really disgraceful, was how she did not support and voted against the Honor the Pact Act, which provided healthcare access to those service members who had exposure to toxic burn pits in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where I served, and had prolonged exposure, so much so that they're now suffering from terrible cancers. It's unconscionable to me to prevent our veterans from having access to those kinds of healthcare resources, because the agreement that I believe we made as a nation is that when you step up and put the uniform on, that you are entitled to those benefits, that you are entitled to the kind of care when you come back home from a healthcare perspective. And we should be doing everything we can to make sure you have access to it. Part of the challenge is something we were already talking about, that in the communities that we live in, we don't have the healthcare, mental health resources, the community resources available. We're requiring our veterans to travel to probably a place like Syracuse or in other areas of the district to Albany, hopping on a shuttle or driving a couple hours to go to the VA health center. The best way to make sure that our veterans have access to the kind of care and resources we believe that they are entitled to is to make sure that they're available in the communities where they live. And so that requires investment and focus on what are the full suite of resources we need available in our communities. And I think those are the kinds of investments we need to make. I think that there's also an orientation we need to flip, certainly from Washington, from a VA perspective. We shouldn't be putting our veterans in such a position where they've got to battle with the bureaucracy to get access to the benefits that they believe that they're entitled to have to prove some sort of service connection. I think we should be operating from a presumption of entitlement, that you are entitled to the benefit as a byproduct of your service. You shouldn't have to prove that your service was connected to the kind of healthcare issues that you're now facing. That's a change in mindset, and that's something that we need to, I think, push forward in Washington.
I've got to piggyback off him. How would you have voted on the enlistment deduction that they just did in pay grade?
I'm not familiar with that particular piece. Would you mind explaining it to me?
They just, I do believe that they cut it 3.5%, but also boosted the afterpay, combat pay and all that after you got out the
Okay.
3.5% because of inflation.
Yeah. Well, I'm not familiar enough with the legislation, but what I can say, at least from a value perspective, is that we should certainly be remunerating and paying our military, their families, what we need to do to make sure that they have the resources to accomplish the mission. That's around clarity, as well as increasing pay for our military. We're asking people to step up and serve, to put their lives in harm's way. That's an impact not just on them, it's an impact on their families who may be at home. And in order for them to actually accomplish the mission, they have to have the resources and our full support. So I would advocate for increasing our military pay, certainly during these very challenging times where we have inflation, right? And so the dollar doesn't go as far as it needs to. So we need to at least keep up with inflation, if not supersede it. The other issue that I'll tie into, and this is something that Secretary of Defense has acknowledged, that our military families, not veterans, we have existing service members are now suffering from housing insecurity and food insecurity. That should never happen in America. We should never have a scenario where an active duty service member and their family are having challenges getting food on the table or an affordable place to live. So those are areas that we'd certainly want to focus on as well.
And as well, going with the militia, coming from a Second Amendment standpoint, how would you vote on HR 18?
Oh, we just talked about it. So, and just to reiterate, I would have voted against it. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment and believe that that particular bill is ill-suited for both the time and in its construct. I think it would divide the coalition we have right now to address gun violence. And the best way we do that is by not focusing on styles of weapon, or it's really around keeping any firearm out of the hands of somebody that's going to do themselves and others harm through common sense solutions that we agree on, where you find lawful gun owners, those of us who support the Second Amendment, around universal background checks, some red flag type opportunities that we can support our law enforcement to keep firearms out of the hands of cop killers, kid killers, etc.
So definitely the aesthetics of a firearm do not define what a firearm is.
Correct. Yeah. No more so should camouflage pants and the style of those pants be, dictate, what I might represent, right? Styling shouldn't be a determinant about capability. And that's something I hear from, gun owners all the time. And that's where I think that the challenges has when folks hear assault weapons, they hear different things. And that's where we can continue to have, I think, an ongoing conversation. But that perspective that you just offered, I think, is the valid other side of that equation. Yeah. Can I go right here? I'll come back to you.
Hi, Tom Oakley, also a veteran, and a Second Amendment question though, since you brought it up. In your view, what's the relationship between, and the Second Amendment is only one sentence.
Yeah.
What's your thought about the relation between the part before the comma and the part after the comma?
Well, I'll at least offer what the Supreme Court has determined. And the most recent Supreme Court decisions have reaffirmed an individual right to bear arms. And that's what the Second Amendment, as interpreted, really represents.
And I didn't ask about the court, I knew that.
Yep.
What's your view of the part before the comma?
Well,
and what influence that has on the part after the comma?
I'm going to derive my interpretation and understanding of the Constitution from those constitutional scholars as we seek to protect them.
I thought there was some, I may be wrong, but I thought there was some sort of a law that forbade a gun manufacturer from being sued for their gun being used in a crime.
Yeah.
So saying, how could the Sandy Hook community have sued the Remington Arms Company because their gun was used in the mass killing of the children in Sandy Hook? How could that have happened, and why haven't other gun manufacturers been sued for all of these other mass killings that have happened around the country?
Right.
Why did they succeed
Yeah.
when other gun manufacturers have not been sued?
I don't know the answer to the question in terms of why one and not the other. It's certainly worth looking into. I'm happy to take a look at that. But I think you raise an important sort of point in terms of the responsibility that we all have. And it's certainly, I think we always focus on the individual, but as a community, and I think our community is actually a strong one to set a good example around gun safety and gun responsibility, so that it's not necessarily just an individual's responsibility, it's the responsibility for all of us. It's a responsibility to set a good example as family members, members within our community, hunters or sportsmen and women to actually pass on a culture of gun responsibility and gun safety. And that might also extend to gun manufacturers to make sure that they're part of the solution to making sure that the use of those firearms that they're producing are being done so in a responsible and safe manner. Oh, okay.
Hi,
Yep.
Matt.
Hi.
My name is Lynn.
Hi, bud.
I'm an old hippie. And I've been around, this is my area,
Yeah.
and I grew up here. And I think you're right, in many ways, this is a moderate, I'm not necessarily, but this is a moderate area. For many years, I voted for a Republican. I voted for Sherry Bowler several times because I felt like he addressed issues. He put country and region before his party. I
Yeah.
think there was a time we could do that, and he could do that. And I could meet him on the street at the St. Patrick's Day blowout on Barrack Street, and he would be there, and I'd shake his hand, and I'd say, when you voted just to protect abortion. And I was grateful for that, and I could work on the other stuff. I saw a real watershed with the Citizens United. It changed everything. It's changed everything. And I knew the day it stated, that corporations are people, my friend.
Right.
I know that is, it's a dark piece of who we are.
Right.
And it's changed us in government,
Yeah.
and politicians. So do you have any thoughts about what we can do to readjust, to adjust back to a place where money is not the driver in who we are as Americans?
Yes. And so the question really comes down to this, if you're not familiar, Citizens United was a Supreme Court decision, now what, a decade more or so?
More.
We have more,
Yeah.
in which a determination was made that really impacted campaign finance. And certainly corporate entities could really provide a tremendous amount of resources to their preferred candidates.
And don't have this.
Correct. And there are a lot of now questions emerging around dark money, untraceable money. Where is it really coming from? Now, you should know, at least from my perspective, I took a pledge against any corporate money in this campaign. The only contributions I take are from individuals. So I will never be in a position where any corporate entity has sort of sway, certainly won't be in a position to contribute to my campaign. And I'm encouraged by others who take that pledge as well. I think that there's more that needs to be done, because you point out something I think that's exactly right. We have politicians now who aren't interested in addressing the common challenges we're facing. We have politicians who are interested in their re-election. We have politicians who are interested in advancing their own careers. We have politicians who have sold us out and addressing our problems in order to move forward with their own career. I think Elise Stefanik is chief among them. She's certainly on a full take of any number of corporate sponsors who have provided resources to her in her campaigns, and she answers to them, not to us. She doesn't show up and answer our questions. You better believe she shows up when they're about to write a check. And so that is, I think, a terrible aspect of what we have going on right now in American politics. And it's one that immediately needs to be addressed. But I don't think we stop there. I think we need term limits. We need term limits, certainly in Congress. Supreme Court, we already have it at the highest office of the land in the presidency. Why not everywhere else? And this cuts both ways, right? I'm not sure why Chuck Grassley or Dianne Feinstein are representing, now their states elected them, that's up to their voters, but I'm not sure we're particularly well served as an American nation by having folks like that who have been in politics forever. Congresswoman Stefanik has been in for 8 years. She's going on to her 5th term, or at least trying to. We have the opportunity to stop her right now. I'm taking a pledge that I will self-impose a term limit in saying only 4 terms. Only 4 terms will I serve in Congress. And I think we need more folks to at least impose upon themselves that limit, if not actually have legislation to push forward, and I will advocate for that. But another area, and this is something that someone that has supported us in our campaign, Democratic Congresswoman out of Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, happens to also be a former CIA officer. But she's been pushing forward banning the prospect of members of Congress or their families from holding stock or trading stocks.
Yes.
Because they shouldn't be using insider information that they're learning from hearings or they're learning from closed-door meetings from industries to then go benefit their own personal portfolios. And so that's something I think would be helpful. Get the money out of the business of politics, get term limits in place, and restore power back to the people. Because our elected representatives should only be working for us and no one else.
Thank you. Campaigns too, would
Yeah.
get, fund campaigns through public money or
Yeah.
through, I'll make a donation,
Yeah.
but, it goes to.
Right. Ma'am, you had a question before. Yeah. Sure. Questions around bail reform, early prison release, and just rising crime in general. Now, on this particular issue, it's really a state-specific one. It's not a federal one, but it's something that I hear about a lot. I hear about the challenges that our law enforcement are having, our judges are having, because sometimes they feel like their hands are tied in keeping our community safe. And this is another example in one that I'm going to take a different side than our party that is in control in Albany. And it's allowing downstate legislators to have a little bit more of an outsized influence around what's going on in upstate. I think that that's a challenge. That has happened on a number of different bills, certainly on this one. We want to make sure that our law enforcement have the resources and the support and trust to do what they need to do to keep our community safe. That also extends to our judges, to have the autonomy to make a decision about an individual who's in front of them who may pose a threat and a danger to our community. Put them in a position, we've empowered them either through elections or some other means, where we have said, we trust you to make a decision for our community. Let's allow them to have that kind of trust and not have legislators hamstringing folks. I'm a former federal employee who worked at the CIA, and I didn't like it when federal legislators necessarily told me how to accomplish my mission. So I can't imagine what it's like for our local law enforcement, for our local judges, to have such constraints put on them as well. And I know that this is an ongoing discussion. What I hear from folks in our local community is it's one that needs to be resolved, either through clarity or through actual changes to the legislation.
Yeah, over the last 6 years, I think domestic issues have taken a well-earned prominence in our discussion. Stop and think about it. Every single question that was asked tonight has been on domestic policy. So what I'd like to do is give you an opportunity to perhaps mention foreign policy. What do you think of the Middle East these days? What do you think of our involvement with NATO? What do you think of normalizing relationships with Cuba? These are areas that aren't talked about much anymore.
You're right.
But they're there.
They are. They certainly are. So the question is really around foreign policy and a lot of different issues related to that. And I think you're right. We have reoriented, I think, to domestic issues and appropriately so. Certainly after 2 decades of foreign conflict, certainly after 9/11. That was near and dear to my heart. I could probably talk a little too much about this, so you're going to have to watch out. Because I was a national security professional. And that's right. That's right. And so there were challenges across the globe, and what we've seen is this ebbing and flowing, right? There were some challenges that we had with certain misadventures, certainly in warfare, places like Iraq, where I served as well. And the challenge we saw with the war in Afghanistan, and certainly how it came to a close. And I'll make a macro point about this. I spent most of my career focused on Afghanistan. Our counterterrorism efforts there, going after those who conducted the attack of 9/11, their close associates. And the way that conflict drew to a close was heartbreaking for me as well as it was for many of my colleagues. And I think there's a lot of blame that go around on that. True to form, you're going to hear me criticize Democrats, even though I am a Democrat. Country before party. I think this president and this administration bungled the withdrawal. But I think the prior administration signed a surrender deal that sort of hamstrung us all. That was a really poor deal. You want to know what was else the problem? Congress wasn't anywhere to be found in providing oversight about what the executive branch was doing. In order for our government to work, to make sure that we're advancing our national security interests, that we're doing the things correctly on the foreign policy arena, our elected representatives need to be more concerned about showing up at oversight meetings than advancing their own career. And on this in particular issue of Afghanistan, Congresswoman Stefanik had an opportunity on May 12th of 2021 because she sits on the House Armed Services Committee. And on that day, the Pentagon came in to provide their first update on their plans for withdrawal from Afghanistan. Congresswoman Stefanik failed to participate. You want to know what she had plenty of time to do that day? Vote Liz Cheney out of her position so that Elise Stefanik could take it. She's got plenty of time for her own career, but not time to make sure that our service members, their family members, that we've got clarity about a national security strategy. And that cuts across the board on many other issues, and there are other members of Congress that are probably guilty of that as well. I may touch on NATO and Ukraine, because that's another issue. And here I'll go to the other side of this. I'll give this administration a lot of credit, because the prior administration, we talk about defunding the police, prior administration was trying to defund NATO and tear apart our alliances because they were really about withdrawing from the world. That leaves us less safe and secure. America is the strongest nation ever, the strongest nation in the world. But we are even stronger when we work with partners and allies. And NATO's a key component of that. Vladimir Putin had been investing at least a decade's worth of energy in undermining NATO, undermining the West's commitment to protecting NATO allies or other countries that fell within their sphere of influence. They certainly did so in getting involved in our elections, but not just here. They were doing so throughout the UK, through Germany, and elsewhere. And I believe that Vladimir Putin was trying to cash in on his investment by invading Ukraine. And what we were able to do, largely through some support from my former colleagues in the intelligence community, was to identify his plans and intentions before he took action. And then that information was shared with our NATO allies. And our diplomatic corps and the President and the Secretary of State rallied the world community and NATO together to say, here's the information about what Putin's going to do. And then they took that information and made it public. And they said, here's what he's going to do before he's going to do it, preventing some sort of false veneer for those actions that would have undermined NATO unity, that would have undermined the effectiveness of sanctions. Right now, one of the greatest tools that we have on the battlefield in Ukraine is the low morale of Russian troops, because they don't believe in that mission. And I think that we have to continue to defend and support democracies like Ukraine. There are a lot of questions right now around Taiwan and threats from China there. So while we may be focused domestically, the world is still a scary place. And the best way to make sure that we are protecting our national security interests, vital national interests, is through working with partners and allies so that we're not footing the bill. Because I don't believe in that either. We shouldn't necessarily be the world police. There is a middle ground to be found, and we have to strike that balance.
What are your thoughts about the FBI's training that has come out in the last few months, classifying MVEs?
And I'm sorry, what is it?
MVEs.
Do you have?
Militant violent extremists.
Okay.
It does say this could be in connection, but not just a symbol regards the connection, but the fact that the Gonzalez flag, the Gadsden flag, anything to do with the 3%ers or Oath Keepers,
Yeah.
all of these, in the FBI's eyes, represents militant violent extremists.
Yep.
But when you read those, it was released by Project Veritas.
Okay.
When you read those training manuals, it didn't say anything about BLM, nothing about Antifa, nothing about any of these other groups that actually did all this stuff to our nation.
Yep.
But it focused on the fact that the hometown boy is the evil.
Yeah. So the
What can you say to that?
So the question is really around violent extremism and what our federal government is doing in terms of responding to that. Most of my career was spent with international terrorism and extremism, so not as much of a domestic terrorism or violent extremist professional. However, this administration did take, I think, and rightfully so, a recognition that there has been a rise of domestic terrorism in our nation. And it is as compelling a challenge right now at this very moment as some of the international terrorism that we faced in the past. And there's a question around those individuals who would espouse the use of violence in order to pursue a political aim. That is the textbook definition of terrorism. And that goes across multiple political aims. So I think to your point, there are some things on the far right, on a spectrum of political ideology. There are also some things on the far left that those individuals who would espouse violence in pursuit of those political aims fall into a category of a violent extremist, potentially even a domestic terrorist. And many of our federal law enforcement are in a position where they have to address those challenges. But it's not just them, it's our state and local law enforcement as well. I'll give you a little anecdote. One of the first jobs that I ever had in the world of counterterrorism while I was at Siena College. I did an internship, it was my senior year, with the New York State Police. And I went in there with a counterterrorism unit, thinking right after 9/11, I'd be finding Al-Qaeda sleeper cells or helping them do that work. And they had me working on domestic violent extremists, white nationalists in particular. Because for our state and local law enforcement, this has been the terrorist threat that they've been dealing with for decades. And it's appropriate for us to be providing resources for them to be able to address that threat. But the recognition is that in a democracy, there is no place for violence in order to achieve political ends. We achieve political ends at the ballot box. And so regardless of classification or where they may be on a political spectrum, all of those folks need to be treated, I think, equally and understood. If you're going to pose a threat to our local community, to our nation, and espousing or promoting violence, that is a threat that needs to be dealt with.
So what you're saying is that with these, if these FBI, training manuals did exist, which they do, you would have added the far left as well.
Yeah, and
The ones
back
that
in
burned down cities and terrorized people for almost 3 years.
yeah, back in the day, there used to be organizations that may still exist that were in the Environmental Liberation Front, ELF. Yeah, they would go to they were an environmentally focused organ, and they go to like a Hummer dealership and light things on fire, and have them explode and create violent acts. And so, yeah, it goes across the political spectrum. And if there are going to be, not to sort of dictate what manuals should be, but we should be looking at that entire spectrum of threat. Yeah.
Is Elise going to agree to debate? Because I'd love to see that.
The question is, will Stefanik agree to debates? We've called for them. There are media outlets, at least 3, that have offered them to both of us. I've agreed. I'm game. Let's go. Let's get them scheduled and go. She's refused thus far.
She can't. She can't. It would make her look too bad. And she looks bad enough already.
She wouldn't know what to wear.
And so we're gonna keep putting pressure to make sure, because again, it's not about me. It's about all of you. You deserve access to your representative. You deserve someone asking her tough questions about her record of results or lack thereof.
Yes.
Because this election is a referendum on her, at least the last 2 years, if not the last 8. She's going to try to talk about the Biden administration and Democrats in Washington. And yeah, you know what? Her job is the number 3 in House Republican leadership. That's part of her role as the messaging chief. But our expectation, she's a representative for us in New York 21. This is a referendum on her. Let's ask some tough questions about why she voted against the PACT Act. Let's ask her some tough questions about why she voted against access to reproductive rights or contraception. Let's ask her some tough questions about why she voted against reducing the cost of prescription drugs for seniors. She needs to be put on, standing up in front of you all and answering those questions. I certainly will keep calling her to account in every forum that we have an opportunity to do. Yep.
Call for debate on television.
Yep. Yes, and the expectation is for
Out on public.
at least 3 of those. And so we'll keep calling her out whenever we have the opportunity to do so. But all of those should be televised, and it's a big district. We should have as many outlets as possible. Okay, we're gonna do one more question, and then I'll be around for a couple more minutes to meet privately if
Matt,
you
in
like.
regards to Social Security,
Yeah.
been on the news several times that the Republicans are looking to try to get rid of Social Security.
Yeah.
And Medicare.
And Medicare. What is your take on that?
Yeah.
Would you look into trying to change the Social Security law to codify it, and make it 100%, where nobody can touch it anymore?
Yeah. So the question is really around how do we protect Social Security, Medicare. My parents are seniors, so this is personal for me. And I don't really trust people like Elise Stefanik with my parents' Social Security and Medicare. Certainly not someone who was an architect about dismantling them. Before she ran for Congress, she was the architect of a plan for Paul Ryan to dismantle these things. So that's always in the back of her mind. And what we have right now are folks like Rick Scott in Florida who have put forward a plan for all Republicans to say every 5 years, we're going to revisit these things. But every 5 years, that means that they would do away with them because that's their orientation. They want to privatize it. They want to take it away from providing true security for our seniors from a healthcare as well as a resource perspective. I'm going to do everything that I can as a member of Congress to not just protect them, but to solidify them through the kind of funding that they need to have. Because right now they're on a trajectory potentially of becoming insolvent. And there are some small little tweaks that can be made to put them on a surer footing. And those are the things that we can and should do. Because, I'm sorry, if any of you are recipients of Social Security and Medicare right now, how do you feel about this threat that we're now facing of a Republican takeover or folks like Elise Stefanik stripping that away from you? We're operating in a time right now where folks feel a tremendous sense of insecurity. Certainly after 2 years of a deadly pandemic, certainly after this chaos that we're seeing on January 6th in our democracy, certainly as we face inflation and rising gas costs, folks are wondering who's got my back? Where is the state safety and stability right now? And for many folks, Social Security and Medicare provides that stability, that safety, that security for all of us. And so it's incredibly important for us to protect those. I'll stick around right here. Feel free if you want to come up and ask. I'll try not to.